We're going to complete today's notes in similar fashion to the executive branch foldable, although the foldable is a little bit different. I'm going to start today, just like I did with the executive branch foldable, showing you the titles and where you write and all of that good stuff. So let's start with the foldable itself. You should have gotten, before today, the foldable itself. It should already be in your notebook. Just like the last time, I am doing my titles, or I have done my titles in color. You are not required to do yours in color unless you want to. Just like last time, I am going to suggest that if you need time to complete each one of the sections, then you can pause the video and restart it when you're ready to move on. So obviously today's title is the judicial branch, and it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is structure/organization. The second part is powers, and the third part is jurisdiction. So when we go to do the notes today, you're going to notice that just like this at the top of the screen, it's going to tell you the title of the section, and then it's either going to say top or bottom. So that'll tell you where it goes in the foldable. So if it says top, it's going to go above the line like I'm pointing at in this picture right here. And if it says bottom, it's going to go on the bottom section below the line where I'm pointing in this picture. So as I said, you'll notice that I have the structure organization section, and it says top. So this is going to go above the line. In the United States, we have what's called a dual court system. Dual is 2. So in other words, we have 2 sets of courts. You have the federal courts, and if you remember, federal is another word for national. So you have the national courts and you have the state courts. And they are 2 separate entities. They basically don't really go or work together. It's 2 separate parts. So let's talk about the structure organization of the judicial branch at the national level is what we'll be focusing on for this unit. When we start studying state government during the next unit, that's when we'll study the state courts. So this goes below the line. This is the bottom of the structure organization section. So at the top, you have the U.S. Supreme Court. You do not have to box it in like I have here. You can just write U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually has 9 justices. A justice is another word for a judge. There is no jury. So this court does work a little bit different. There is no trial in this court like you see on television. We will get down to the nitty-gritty about each one of the parts of the judicial branch as we break down the unit in the coming days. Below the U.S. Supreme Court, you have the U.S. Court of Appeals. There are 3 justices that sit on each court of appeals, and again, there is no jury. There also, once again, is no trial in this court. So in other words, for both of these courts, their case has already been heard, and these 2 courts would be hearing the case on appeal. At the very bottom, you have the U.S. District Court. If you have ever seen a show or watched a movie about a court case or having a trial, this would be what you're familiar with. There's one judge and there's a jury. And in this court, there is a trial. So this is where you have the witnesses and the evidence and the questioning and all of that kind of stuff that you would normally see on television. So we're moving on to the powers section, which we're at the top, so above the line. The only thing you're going to write in this section is interprets laws. In the past, we talked about the fact that Congress makes the laws, the president executes or enforces the law, and the court is responsible for interpreting the law. So in other words, they have to figure out what the law means in order to decide if somebody has broken it. So on the bottom half, we're going to write a couple of things. The main power of the Supreme Court specifically is to decide the constitutionality of laws. So sometimes laws get written and unintentionally they might take away a constitutional right. If that's the case, the Supreme Court could declare that law unconstitutional, and if so, it does become null and void. And we're going to talk about some specific instances of this as we get to talking about judicial review specifically. So in other words, whether or not laws follow the Constitution. As I said, this is also known as judicial review. The court can also decide if presidential acts are constitutional. If an act is declared unconstitutional, it doesn't necessarily mean the president's broken the law. It just means he's done something that goes against the Constitution. And a good example of this is the punishments that President Bush executed when he was president right after September 11th, 2001. The methods for punishing and questioning and all of that kind of stuff were declared unconstitutional. So they had to stop doing it. So in other words, the judicial branch answers this question. Do laws or acts follow the Constitution? And if the answer is no, they become void. In other words, as if they didn't exist. Moving on to the jurisdiction section, we're at the top, so above the line. There are two types of jurisdiction when it comes to the courts. You have original jurisdiction, original being first. That's an easy way to remember it. This is when a court hears a case for the first time. So in other words, it's not been heard in any other court before this one. So this is the trial. When there is original jurisdiction, that means that it's a trial. They're hearing the case for the first time. Then there's appellate jurisdiction. This means that they're hearing the case on appeal. So that means the trial has already happened, and whoever was involved in the trial would be appealing their case. So that means that this would not happen in the U.S. district courts because they're at the bottom. There's no court below them, so they would have original. And then the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court would have appellate. We're going to talk about that here in a second. So in other words, the case has already been heard. The bottom section of jurisdiction, so below the line, original jurisdiction happens in the U.S. District Court, as I mentioned, and in the U.S. Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court actually only has limited original jurisdiction. So in other words, they're not going to hear very many cases for the first time. An example might be if a diplomat from another country is on trial, or something happened in the ocean and it goes to trial, or it's a case between two states. Those would all be original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. Otherwise, if it does not fit into one of those categories, it would start in the district court. So then you have appellate jurisdiction, which is hearing the case on appeal. The U.S. Court of Appeals only has appellate jurisdiction. They never hear a case for the first time. But the U.S. Supreme Court actually also shares appellate jurisdiction. So the U.S. Supreme Court has both types of jurisdiction, the first only being on a limited basis. So for your illustrations today, it's already set up for you on the page. I think the only direction that I'm going to change for you is it says to cut out something. You're not going to do that. You're actually just going to draw it today. So whatever, there's 3 boxes, and whatever each box says, that's what you'll be doing for the illustration.